okay? And we're going to start talking about what is power, how do you build it, what does it mean in a track cycling sense, okay? So we've got a few, I wouldn't say equations, I kind of say equivalencies here. Don't take this stuff to be complete gospel truth. It's not completely technically accurate, but what it is accurate enough to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, okay? Speed equals power plus aerodynamics plus inefficiencies, okay? How much power are you putting out? How big is the drag force trying to slow you down? And how big are all the little inefficiencies, all the little losses? When you add all of those up, what do they add up to? Okay, and how fast you go is the sum of those three things. So we've talked about aerodynamics, I've briefly mentioned inefficiencies, and now we're going to talk about power. Okay, power is force applied divided by time taken to reach that force. So if we want to go faster, we either need to be more aero or we need to put out more power. Now, as I say, we're talking about power, okay? And to increase that, you can see from this equivalency here, we either need to increase the amount of force we can put through the pedals, or we need to reduce the time it takes us to do that. So what that means in practice is that either you have to increase your cadence and really spin incredibly fast, or you have to increase your strength and really build up your muscle power. Now, the old school sprinting, the way that used to be done was just super high cadences, you know, really, really high, 150, 160, 170 RPM. You know, you go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, those were the kind of leg speeds they were achieving. What they found now is actually you tend to be able to do better at much lower cadences by getting much, much stronger. If you take Callum Skinner in Rio 2016, he told me for his Flying 200, where he rode 9.7, he was riding 136-inch gear, which I think gives about 113 RPM. If you were to say that to a sprint coach in the 80s, they would completely laugh you out of the velodrome. They'd say, that's madness, that's far too slow, it's not how you do sprint. But that's the way modern sprinting is going, okay? It's going towards this very, very high force productions, very high strength, and actually much lower cadences. So we're going to talk a little bit about how a sprinter trains to be able to really put that power and that speed through their bike. Phase in your year. You have 4 main training phases. You more or less have that in endurance as well. If you're an endurance rider, you might be familiar with, you know, pre-competition and competition, base and build. We talk about it a bit differently in sprint terms. Your 4 main sprint phases are strength, power, speed, and speed endurance. And then you kind of have taper at the end, which I haven't called a phase in its own right. You could maybe argue that it is, but I've sort of lumped it in with speed endurance because you actually more or less do those things at the same time. So your big thing, if you think of it like a pyramid, okay, the base is strength. If you want to be a sprinter, if you really want to go fast, get in the gym. You need to get strong, okay? That's the first thing, basically. You don't need to be a monstrous great power lifter. You don't need to be the strongest person in the world. But all other things being equal, getting stronger is probably going to help you go faster. As long as you do the right things on the bike and the right things in the gym, a lot of sprinting is actually about lifting weights. There's a saying in track sprint, which is that a track sprinter is a power lifter who happens to ride a bike. And it's pretty accurate. You just have to look at people like Chris Hoy, Robert Forsterman, and just the sheer size of them. You can sort of see that that's more or less what you end up doing. So you would maybe spend 8 months of your year building strength, just working on that element. You'd spend maybe 6 weeks, 2 months on power, which is turning that strength into a really explosive sort of development, really being able to apply it really, really quickly. You'd spend maybe 4 weeks, a month on speed, just going, you know, really, really fast behind other riders, behind a motorbike, on your race kit, just getting used to that pace, teaching your body what it's like to do that race pace. And then once you've got everything there, once you've got your power, you've got your speed, you've got your legs, you've got your strength, that's when you work on taking that speed and maintaining it for as long as you can. And you do that as you're starting to taper off the intensity of, the volume, not the intensity, of the work that you're doing. So we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about how we do each of these things. If you want to get stronger, the best way to do it is to get into the gym. It's not impossible to get stronger by riding your bike. You can put a massive great gear on, you can ride up a really big hill really slowly, but the thing is, your pedals move away from you as you press on them. And it's very difficult to build strength when the pedals are moving away from you, because it means that you don't really have time for your muscles to really reach peak force. It's much easier to do it in the gym. If you've done any weight training yourself, or if you've seen videos of World's Strongest Man or powerlifters or anything like that, you'll see that as they're starting the lift, a lot of the time they're really struggling and trying, and then it starts to go. Okay, you don't get that aspect when you're on the bike, because you just can't generate enough force to really build pure strength. So it is something you do, riding your bike on big gears, but it's always complementary to the strength you've built elsewhere. Okay, in terms of what you should do, avoid stuff like bicep curls and so on, because you don't want to do that. It's a bodybuilding move. The sort of thing that works very well are big compound movements, things like squats, things like deadlifts. As I've got here, the hex bar deadlift is thought to be a little bit better. That's where instead of a straight bar in front of you, you've actually got a hexagon shaped bar that you stand inside. You've got two handles either side of your body. It's a little bit more cycling specific. It's a little bit more like holding a set of handlebars. And the advantage of that sort of work is, if you're doing squats and deadlifts, you're not just working your legs. You're working your back, you're working your core, you're working your chest, you're working your abs. You're doing all of these different muscle groups at the same time. So instead of doing, hundreds of sit-ups or crunches, you're working your abs at the same time. You're working your stabilizing muscles, you're working your core. It's really, really good training, those big, big compound movements. Okay. You want to do a little bit of upper body, maybe some pull-ups, maybe some bent over rows, but we're not bodybuilders, we're track sprinters. Most of what we're going to do is going to be focused on the lower body. You want to have enough upper body strength to stabilize your bike and to be able to pull nice and hard on the bars as you're accelerating, but you don't want to be huge, sort of Arnold Schwarzenegger type, massive great pecs or anything like that. It's just, you don't need all of that muscle. If you want to do it, then by all means, go ahead and do it. But if you're training just to get quicker on the bike, you want to focus on those big lower body compound movements. Okay. In terms of how you train, I'm not a strength coach. That's not really what I do. So I don't do programming for that. But roughly speaking, you start out lots of reps, relatively low rest, relatively low weight. And then over a period of, a couple of months, you gradually build up and up and up to fewer reps, heavier weights, longer rests, until you're just doing, peak effort. Then you go back down, have a week or two, rest, light weights, and then you start building up again with the aim of reaching a higher peak the next time. All right. So let's turn over to my notes. It's all very well building your strength in the gym, but what you then need to do is put it on the bike. And this is actually the bit a lot of people miss out on. I've spoken to quite a few people in the past who've said, I've had this massive squat or this enormous deadlift, but it hasn't made me any quicker. Well, the reason for that is it's not as simple as just being strong. Okay, a lot of it is what we call neurological adaptation. A lot of it is your brain being able to fire your muscles in the right way. And the best way to do that, best way to be able to apply that strength, is to ride big gears on your bike, really, really low cadences, really, high force, low velocity. Now, I said earlier, you can't really build strength like this. That is true. Okay, you build strength in the gym, and then you transfer that strength into a usable form by doing this sort of training on the bike. Okay, so an example of the sort of thing you might do, a session that I really like for strength, is a progressive kilo. So I'll do 500 meters on as big a gear as I can fit on my bike, in the saddle, sometimes on the aero bars, just focusing on being as stable and as strong as I can. On 500 meters, gradually building up the pace until I'm almost at full speed, and then 500 meters flat out. Then I'll have a nice long rest, 20, 25 minutes, and I'll do a 750 or two 750s, where it's 250 meters building up to speed, and then 500 meters all out. Then I'll just do an all out 500 meter to finish. And the reason I like that as a session is because you get lots of good training in it, but you start out doing your big hard effort at the start of the session, then your next effort's a little bit less bad, your next effort is a little bit less bad. And what that does psychologically is that really lets you keep the intensity super high. Because if you do your first effort and you're just completely broken, you're absolutely in bits, which you usually are after efforts like this, and you think, oh God, I've got another 3 of those to do, it's really, really difficult to get the intensity into the range you need to get it to on the second and third, just because you know how painful it's going to be. But if when you're doing your second and third efforts, you can say, actually, yeah, this is going to be bad, but it's not going to be as long, and the one after this is going to be even shorter, it lets you hit that super high intensity each time. And that's actually a bit of advice that transfers over really well into endurance training. It's something I say to a lot of riders. Intensity is important. Okay, it's the most important thing in terms of training. You keep your intensity, and what you're doing in terms of suggested RPM for progressive efforts. I wouldn't necessarily say so, Lee. In terms of RPM, you kind of want to be doing this on the biggest gear you can fit on your bike. So whatever that gear ends up being is kind of going to dictate what your RPM is. So yeah, it's not really something that I wouldn't prescribe an RPM like that. I would say you're using that first 500 meters to build up to pretty much full effort, and then you're doing full effort second 500 meters. Yeah, it's not necessarily about what gear you use or how fast you're going. It's about the amount of effort you're putting in and the fact that you're trying to stay nice and stable and strong and just really press on the pedals whilst you're doing it. That's the takeaway, rather than that you should have any specific RPM on it. You'll see down the bottom here, I had one Olympic champion ask me, or say to me, that they actually do 5 to 10 RPM. And he said that they had an ergometer, a static bike, which they would sit on and do efforts, but they couldn't get it down low enough. So they actually got a coach to press a sponge against the flywheel of the bike, so it would get right down to that really, really low efforts. And if you follow Teo Boss on Instagram, you sometimes see him posting pictures of himself doing something similar. So yeah, build your strength in the gym, and then big gear efforts on the bike. You can do starts as well. You can do sort of short little starts. It doesn't really matter what you do. What I'm trying to explain here is the concepts around it. So find what works for you, but the heart of it is that you need to be spending time in that really, really low cadence, really high force area of your riding. Okay, so move on now. I'm going to talk about power. Okay, so it's all very well and good to be really, really strong and to be able to lift 200 kilos in the gym or whatever, but if you can't do that quickly, then that's not really going to help you very much on the bike. What you need to do is take that strength and then work on applying it really quickly. So there are lots of different ways you can do this, but basically off the bike, you want to be doing ballistic movements. You want to be doing jump squats, sled pulls, hopping over hurdles. Olympic lifts and gym are super, super good for this, because you have to generate a huge amount of speed and force to get that bar off the ground. When you're doing plyometric exercises, stuff like jump squats, stuff like sled pulls, stuff like jumping over, you don't want to do that with lots and lots of weight. The recommendation is that you don't use any more than about 30% of your 1 rep max. It's not about can you jump into the air with 100 kilos on your shoulders. It's about how high can you jump with 30 kilos on your shoulders. So that's the thing you focus on. You will find as well that your actual strength tends to go down a bit. That goes back to those neuromuscular adaptations that I was talking about earlier. You're now telling your brain, you've been saying to your brain for ages and ages, I just want to be strong. I just want to be able to move this weight upwards. You're now saying to it, I want to be able to move this weight really, really fast. So that change in your neurological pathways is going to reduce the absolute maximum you can lift, but hopefully it'll mean that what you can lift, you can do much more quickly. And this actually has an interesting effect, or at least had a very interesting effect for me, which is when I do power training, the first week or two, I get super sleepy. And I think what that is my brain processing the fact that my training has suddenly changed. It's my brain just saying, you need to sleep so we can sort this out and we can understand what it is that we need to do. And on the bike, you're going to be doing shorter efforts. You're going to be really working on, jumping out the saddle and accelerating as hard as you can, kicking as hard as you can, lots of short starts, small gears, just work on really trying to get that speed up and really just trying to snap as much as you possibly can. Okay. In terms of, if I had to say one thing, power cleans, I have been told by many, many top sprinters, are just about the best exercise you can do. That's actually something I really want to try and work on next year. Unfortunately, I can't in my garage because it's got a concrete floor and I don't have bumper plates. So I'm probably going to need to join the gym at some point. But yeah, Olympic lifts, sled pulls, jump squats, those are the types of exercises you want to be doing, okay? And you don't do loads and loads of reps of those. You do maximum sort of 3 to 5 reps, and then you have a nice long rest, and then you do just a few reps again, just so that you can really focus on being completely explosive, because you don't want to start slowing down, okay? You want to stop doing this type of exercise as soon as your speed starts to drop off, okay? Speed, the third of our 4 phases. You want to get your leg speed up. You want to get your ability to produce power at race cadences. So if you have the facility to do it, this is when you want to start chasing faster riders. This is when you want to start going behind the motorbike, and you want to do all of this stuff on either your race gear or a tiny little bit under it, because it's important as well that you learn what it's going to feel like. Sorry, it's important to learn what it's going to feel like at full pelt. Okay, can you hold the bike down? What does the G-force feel like? Can you hold your race position? So try and get on the track chasing somebody faster so that you can really get up to speed and find all that stuff out. You also want to be focusing on stuff that's just got absolutely maximum rate of force development. Now, what that is just you going to peak force as quickly as possible. Something that I do that's quite good for this is seated jump squats. So you're sitting down, completely relaxed, legs nice and bent, and then you just explode upwards as quickly as you can. So instead of a typical squat where you go down and you're sort of storing up muscle tension and then you bounce back up again, if you're just going from a seated position, you've just got that focus on how quickly can I make my muscles contract. And that's quite a useful thing to do. There's some good sessions on the internet in terms of leg speed as well. This is when you start to build that leg speed up. And you can do that on the turbo trainer, you can do that on the road bike, you can do that with small gears on the track. There's lots of different options. I would say that if you're on the track during this phase, you should probably be spending your time on your race gear, really trying to go fast rather than trying to do lots of super high cadence stuff. It's actually easier to do that on the road or somewhere else. If you're on the track, it's important to get from it the stuff that you can only get from the track, which in this case is what your race kit's going to feel like, what that speed is going to feel like. Okay, now before I actually come on to that, we're going to talk a little bit about the effect that this type of training is going to have on your cadence and on your speed, because your peak power and the cadence at which you produce that peak power is not going to be the same all throughout your training year. Okay, if this is our situation before we start strength training, then we've got a situation here where our peak power here is 1425 watts, and that is done at 130 RPM. Okay, so this is our situation before we do any training. And then if you go down to 50 RPM here, you can see it's 700 watts, 100 RPM, we've got 1200 watts, and we go up to 200 RPM, we can only put out 800 watts, okay? So that's a situation, we've got this, you know, this nice gradual slope here. We've got a distinct defined peak, and then we've got a drop off like that. So that's all quite clear. That's all quite simple. What you may well find when you start doing strength training is that instead of that nice clear graph, something a bit more like this starts to happen. Okay, this in my notes is called the ugly graph. Okay, because we have our peak here. Our peak power has actually gone down. It's only 1375 watts in this case. And not only has our peak power gone down, we're producing it at a lower cadence. We're only producing our peak power at 120 RPM rather than 130 when we were on full form. But the other thing we'll see is if we go to 50 RPM, we were formerly producing 700 watts. Now we're producing 925. We go to 100 RPM. Formerly, we were producing 1200 watts. Now we're producing 1300 watts. So what's happened here is that our peak power has gone down slightly. But if you then go up a few gears and you ride at a lower cadence, your peak power doesn't drop off as much as it would have done when you were in peak form. Okay, you're still able to go really, really quickly and really, really well, despite the fact that actually you're on a much bigger gear. So this is something you'll notice. You can do a similar time on a much wider range of gears. And then once you hit your actual peak power, you'll tend to find it drops off like this, or perhaps even more steeply like that. So this will be different for everyone. Okay, not everyone will have this effect. Some people will have it even more pronouncedly. The takeaway message from this is not that this is exactly what will happen to you. It's that this is the sort of thing that happens when you're training. Okay. Different types of training are going to have different effects on what your peak power is, where your most efficient cadence is, and on all the values around that as well. It's not going to be a straightforward linear situation. So that was before training. During training, 4 points for guessing what the next graph is. Next graph is after training. Okay, exactly the same shape as the previous graph, but it's all shifted upwards a bit. And if we see all three of them together, what we can see here, if we compare them, this graph here, this blue one at the bottom, this is us before training. This one here, the weirdly shaped one, this is during training. And then this graph here is after training. So what we've done, by training our strength, we've built up our potential power, okay? This kind of area here. When we do our power training, we take this line and we move it from this quite flat line here into this much steeper line here by focusing on the rate at which we can apply our force. And our nice theoretical end goal is that after our period of training, whether it's a year, whether it's 6 months, whether, whatever it is, we take our previous peak power, which was 1425, 1450 at 130 RPM. And at 130 RPM, we can now put out 1600 watts. Okay. What that means in practice is that we'll be using a gear that's a couple of inches bigger. We'll be turning it at the same cadence, and overall we'll be going faster. Okay. So the gears you use throughout your training are going to be very, very different depending on what your focus is. Your peak power is going to be different through the training. Your power across a range of different gears, all this stuff is going to alter and shift around. It's not something to worry about. It's part of the process. By the time we get to the end of the process, we should hopefully have achieved this movement to this, from this lower graph here to this upper graph here. That's what we aim to do. All right. So moving on from there. Speed endurance. Once we've got our speed, we need to work on keeping it going. Okay. This is quite simple to do, and it's really, really painful. You get up to your top speed and you stay there for as long as possible. Okay. You're going to be dropping off. You're going to be losing speed. You're going to be losing power. You just want to make that drop off as little as possible. Okay. So instead of a flying 200 meters, you'll be doing a flying 300, flying 400, flying 500. It's not very nice, but you don't have to do it for much of the year. Okay. You only spend maybe a month or so doing this type of training. It's just the last little cherry on the top as we go into your racing effort. I was talking about the psychological management aspects of it earlier, where I was saying if your duration reduces over the session, it becomes much easier to manage that effort. Same thing applies here. Don't try and do 4 flying 500s, because you just won't be able to maintain the intensity. You know, do a 500, 400, 300, 200, something like that. That's going to be much better for you than trying to do it and just not being able to hit the correct intensities in the middle. Okay. Yeah. So once we've got our speed endurance, or once we're starting to work on our speed endurance, we're also going to do a bit of tapering. Now, this is something I know Lee was asking about earlier. There are quite a few different ways to taper. You've got the stepped approach, where you maybe are doing 4 efforts for one. You know, if you're going to the track 3 times a week, you've got 4 weeks to taper. Then for the first week, you do 4 efforts. The second week, you do 3 efforts. The third week, you do 2 efforts. And the fourth week, you just do 1 effort each time. That would be a stepped reduction in load, where each week you're just dropping down like that. Linear reduction in load, you'd be looking at maybe doing 4, 3, 2, 1, just a nice gradual reduction over the course of your 4 weeks. But what BC found, because they actually did some research into this a few years ago, is that you want to reduce your load exponentially. So what that would look like in terms of this graph, this is maybe you doing up here, this is you maybe doing 4 flying 200s in a session, or 4 flying 300s if you're still working on speed endurance. Then as soon as you start your taper, that's very quickly going to drop off. So you may be going down to 2 or even only 1 flying 200 per session. And then it's going to still be doing, you're still going to be keeping the intensity, you're still going to be putting the effort in, but you're just going to be reducing it down in this sort of pattern. So it reduces very quickly at the start and then less quickly until you're getting towards the end. Now, you don't want to reduce the intensity. You don't want to be riding slowly. You want to be going full gas and doing full gas efforts. So I would not taper down to less than 1 full flying 200, okay, maybe 2. That for me would be the end of my taper. So I go from doing maybe 4 flying 300s, and I would gradually step it down until I was doing 1 to 2 flying 200s. And I would do that over the course of maybe 3-4 weeks of a couple of track sessions each week. It gives you the idea of the sort of way I would want to do it. Okay, you've got to keep the intensity up, because it's the intensity that keeps you nice and ready to go. Okay, there's a bit of a difference between tapering for endurance and tapering for sprint. You need to taper a bit less for an endurance race, because it's important to be very, very fit. So you can be a little bit tired, you can be a little bit fatigued, but as long as you're really, really fit, then you're probably still going to perform well. But in sprint terms, you need to be really, really fresh. So you've got to be well rested, you've got to have reduced your load, and you really need to be really fresh and really ready to go on the day of the event in order to perform well. So you really, really don't want to have too much load going into it. If you're going to go either way in terms of a taper, if you're not sure what to do, I would say go for less rather than more, because that's probably going to be more beneficial for most people. Endurance versus sprint. Okay, this is the next little bit I'm going to go on to, which is, we've talked a lot about the training you have to do as a sprinter, but why is it so different? What is the main thing that makes endurance different to sprint? Well, the clue really is in the names, okay? Most Tour de France riders are not going to have a maximum power output that is any higher than the average person in the street. Chris Froome's power output, his maximum is probably only about 1,000 watts, okay? There've been studies done on top endurance riders, and this is what they found. These top endurance riders are actually, when it comes to the real top end sprint, they're no better than the average person in the street. What they're very good at is sustaining a power. So you pick some guy off the street, you put him against Chris Froome, they're probably going to have the same peak power output. You tell the guy off the street to do 400 watts for an hour, he's going to die after a couple of minutes, and Froome will be just ticking away doing that, because that's what he trains to do. An endurance rider doesn't try to build power. An endurance rider tries to sustain power that physiologically they are already capable of reaching. That's the main difference. Whereas a sprint rider, because they're putting out, they've got to go so fast, they've got to hit 40, 50 miles an hour, they have to be able to put out these huge wattage figures. Harry Levrayson, the men's sprint champion, his peak power is probably 2,500 watts, maybe even more. Emma Hinzer, women's sprint champion, she'll probably be peaking 1,800, maybe touching 2,000 watts, okay? You will really struggle to find someone on the street that can get close to that type of power. People that are really experienced power athletes, rugby players, rowers, and so on, they can sometimes get close to those figures. What they won't be able to do is sustain that power in the same way the top sprinter will be able to do, okay? A kilo rider can hold 1,000 watts for a minute. You think about that, or average 1,000 watts for a minute. That would be the untrained riders maximum for 1 second. That's the difference. That's why the training is so different. It's because the outcomes physiologically are just complete opposite ends of the spectrum. People like Peter Sagan, people like Lizzie Danion, they are going to be training a bit differently. They're going to be doing some weights, they're going to be doing some power training, but fundamentally they are endurance athletes. This is one of the things that people get confused about a little bit when they hear about riders like Mark Cavendish getting called a sprinter. Mark Cavendish is not a sprinter. Mark Cavendish is an endurance rider who has a little bit of a sprint. If you put him against a top track sprinter, he'd be absolutely left for dead. Okay, that's the reality of the situation. So it can get a bit confusing sometimes when you hear these commentators talking about a sprinter in the context of a road cyclist. They've actually got a completely different training regime to what a true track sprinter would be doing. They will be doing some weights, they will be doing some power training. I actually recommend weight training for pretty much every cyclist. It helps you build robustness, it helps strengthen your core. It's something that I found incredibly beneficial in my riding. And if I were to hang up my bike tomorrow, honestly, I would keep doing it. It's probably the biggest training thing that's come out of the last couple of years for me, is just how good weight training is when it comes to all-round athleticism. It makes a huge difference. So, what have we